Hey guys, tonight we dive into one of history's darkest chapters, the world of ancient Greek slavery. A reality so brutal, so dehumanizing, that it makes medieval serfdom look like a luxury vacation. We're peeling back the marble facades and philosophical debates to reveal the horrifying truth. Most of the people who built the glory of ancient Greece weren't free citizens debating democracy in the agora. They were slaves, human property, beaten, broken, and worked to death in the name of civilization. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're standing on a dock in some distant port, maybe on the coast of what we now call Turkey or southern Italy. The year is around 450 BCE. The sun beats down mercilessly as you're shoved forward by rough hands. Iron shackles bite into your wrists, the metal already warm from the Mediterranean heat. Your mouth is dry, your stomach empty, and your future has just been sold to the highest bidder. You are no longer a person, you are property, and your new owner is Greek. But how did you get here? How does a human being become chattel in the cradle of democracy? The answer is simple and terrifying. In ancient Greece, becoming a slave was easier than falling off a cliff, and just as fatal to your humanity. Maybe you were captured in war. Greek armies didn't just conquer territory, they harvested people. When Athens defeated a rebellious city, they didn't just demand tribute. They lined up the survivors and sorted them like livestock. Men, women, children, it didn't matter. Strong backs for labor, pretty faces for pleasure, young minds for household service. War wasn't just about victory, it was about restocking the slave markets. Perhaps you were born into it. Your mother was a slave, which meant you emerged into the world as someone else's possession. No birth certificate, no citizenship, no rights. Just another mouth to feed until you were old enough to work, and that age came frighteningly early. By 6 or 7, you'd be carrying water, sweeping floors, or running messages. Childhood was a luxury, reserved for the free. Or maybe debt destroyed your life. Economic collapse could turn a free citizen into chattel overnight. Borrowed too much grain during a bad harvest. Couldn't pay back the silver you owed for your daughter's dowry. Congratulations, you just sold yourself and your family into bondage. Debt slavery was legal, common, and utterly devastating. One bad season, one failed trade venture, one stroke of misfortune, and you'd find yourself on the auction block. Piracy was another highway to hell. The Mediterranean was crawling with slave raiders who swept down on coastal villages like wolves on sheep. They'd strike at dawn, burning homes, killing those who resisted, and hauling away anyone young and healthy enough to turn a profit. Pirates weren't romantic figures, swashing buckles on movie screens. They were human traffickers, with bronze swords, and no conscience. And then there was simple bad luck. Wrong place, wrong time. Maybe you were traveling between cities when bandits struck your caravan. Maybe you were a shepherd in the hills when a slaving expedition passed through. Maybe you were just walking down the wrong street when someone with power decided they needed fresh slaves, and you looked useful. The thing about ancient Greece is that slavery wasn't a bug in their system. It was a feature. The very foundation of Greek civilization rested on the backs of human beings who had been stripped of their humanity and reduced to tools. Philosophers like Aristotle didn't just tolerate slavery, they justified it. They argued that some people were naturally born to be slaves, that it was the cosmic order, that slavery was actually good for the enslaved because it gave their inferior minds purpose. This wasn't some distant, abstract evil. This was industrial-scale human trafficking that touched every corner of Greek society. In Athens alone, historians estimate that slaves made up anywhere from 25 to 40% of the population. That's potentially 2 out of every 5 people you'd pass on the street. All of them property, all of them trapped. So here you are, standing on that dock, shackled and terrified, about to discover what it really means to be a slave in ancient Greece. And trust me when I say this, everything you think you know about the glory and wisdom of ancient Greece is about to crumble. Because behind every marble statue, every philosophical treatise, every democratic debate were the bloody fingerprints of enslaved human beings who built it all and received nothing but suffering in return. The auction block rises before you like an altar of despair. Rough-hewn stone, stained dark with sweat, blood, and tears from countless sales before yours. You're about to be sold like a goat at market, except a goat probably gets treated better. At least goats are valuable for their milk and meat. You're just a tool that happens to breathe. The slave market in ancient Greece wasn't some back-alley operation. It was central to every major city, usually located right in the agora, alongside vendors selling pottery, olive oil, and fresh fish. Buying and selling human beings was as normal as purchasing bread. More normal, actually, since bread you ate once, a slave you owned forever. The auctioneer, a freeman with calloused hands and dead eyes, grabs your chin and forces your mouth open. He's checking your teeth like you're a horse. Buyers gather around, poking your muscles, examining your hands for calluses that might indicate useful skills, looking for scars that suggest you're a troublemaker, or signs of disease that might make you a bad investment. You stand there naked, or nearly so, while strangers discuss your worth in cold, calculating terms. Look at those shoulders. Good for hauling stone. Bit thin, but young enough to fatten up. Check those feet. Might be a runner. They're not talking about you. They're talking about it. Because that's what you are now. A nit. The bidding starts low. Maybe 30 drachmas. Enough to buy a decent cloak. Your entire existence, your memories, your dreams, your fears, reduced to the price of winter clothing. But the bidding climbs. 40 drachmas. 50. You're not sure if you want the price to go higher or lower. Higher means you might have value, might be treated slightly better. Lower means you're nearly worthless, which could mean a quick death in the mines. The buyers aren't just looking at your body, they're evaluating your potential. Can you read? That makes you valuable for household management or tutoring children. Do you speak multiple languages? Perfect for trade or diplomatic service. Are you young and attractive? Well, that opens up markets you don't want to think about. One potential buyer, a man with soft hands and expensive robes, circles you like a vulture. He's examining your face, your posture, the way you hold yourself despite the chains. He's not looking for muscle. He's looking for intelligence, for someone who can manage his household, keep his accounts, maybe even educate his sons. This might seem like the better option, but household slaves often suffered in ways that made the mines look merciful. Another bidder, this one with dirt under his fingernails and the sun-baked skin of a farmer, is checking your hands and back. He wants to know if you can work the fields, if you can swing a scythe for 16 hours under the blazing sun, if you'll last more than a season before your body gives out. Agricultural slaves had a life expectancy measured in years, not decades. Then there's the mine owner. You can spot him by the silver dust under his fingernails and the way he examines slaves like he's selecting animals for slaughter, because that's essentially what he's doing. The silver mines at Laurium were Greek society's closest approximation to hell on earth. Slaves sent there rarely saw the surface again. The auctioneer rattles off your estimated age, your apparent skills, any languages you might speak. He lies about your health, exaggerates your capabilities, and invents a backstory designed to increase your value. Maybe he claims you're a skilled craftsman from a conquered city. Maybe he suggests you're educated, that you can read and write. Truth is irrelevant. Profit is all that matters. As the bidding intensifies, you realize something horrifying. You're hoping for a particular outcome. You're hoping someone specific wins you, as if choosing your own slavery makes it less awful. But there's no good option on that auction block. There's only different flavors of horror. The hammer falls. Sold. For 85 drachmas to the man with soft hands. You've just become more expensive than a prize-winning ram, but cheaper than a decent horse. Your new owner approaches, examining his purchase with the satisfied air of someone who's found a good deal on pottery. He doesn't speak to you. Why would he? You don't speak to your plough or your water jug. Instead, he gestures to one of his existing slaves, a man with dead eyes and fresh welts on his back, who fastens a new set of chains around your ankles. These chains will be your constant companion now, the music of your enslavement. As you're led away from the auction block, you catch glimpses of other sales. A young woman, barely more than a girl, being examined by men who aren't looking at her muscles. An elderly man with scholarly bearing being dismissed by buyers who want younger, stronger property. Children, some so young they're clinging to mothers who've also been sold, to different owners, in different directions. This is the foundation of Greek civilization. This human marketplace where souls are sold and dreams die. Every marble column, every philosophical dialogue, every democratic debate was built on this. The glory of Greece, purchased with human misery. Your new owner's house looms before you like a fortress of despair. From the outside, it looks elegant enough. Whitewashed walls, terracotta roof tiles, a small courtyard garden with olive trees and flowering vines. But for you, it's not a home, it's a prison. And you're about to discover that being a household slave in ancient Greece means living in a world where every comfort is forbidden and every mistake is punished. The house is designed around a central courtyard, with rooms radiating outward like spokes on a wheel. The family quarters are forbidden to you, except when you're working in them, and even then you move like a ghost. Silent, invisible, careful not to disturb the free people who own you. Your quarters are in the basement, if you're lucky, or in a tiny room off the kitchen that's barely large enough for a sleeping mat. There's no window, no source of natural light except what filters down from the courtyard above. The walls are bare stone, damp and cold in winter, stifling in summer. Your bed is a straw pallet that's crawling with fleas, bed bugs, and probably rats. You share this space with the other household slaves. Maybe 5 or 6 people crammed into a room meant for storage. There's no privacy, no personal space, no possessions beyond the rough tunic your owner provides. Privacy is a concept reserved for free people. Slaves exist in a state of constant exposure, constant vulnerability. The day begins before dawn. Not because there's a rooster crowing or natural light streaming through windows, but because the overseer, himself a slave but one with slightly more authority, kicks you awake. There's no gentle awakening, no time to gather your thoughts. You transition instantly from exhausted sleep to urgent terror, because being slow to wake means punishment. You stumble to your feet, joints aching from sleeping on a thin mat over stone floor. Your tunic, the same one you've worn for weeks without proper washing, is stiff with sweat and grime. There's no time for personal hygiene beyond splashing your face with cold water from a communal basin. The kitchen is already bustling with activity. The cook, a slave woman who's been here so long she moves with mechanical precision, is kneading bread for the master's breakfast. The scullery slaves are hauling water from the well, their shoulders already bowed under the weight of amphoras that seem to grow heavier each day. Your first task is cleaning. Not light dusting or tidying up, but the back-breaking labour of maintaining a household with no mechanical aids. You're scrubbing floors on your hands and knees with coarse brushes and lye soap that burns your skin. You're hauling dirty bedding to the washing area, pounding it against stones until your knuckles bleed. You're emptying chamber pots and carrying the contents to the waste area, trying not to retch at the smell. The master's children run through the house like small tyrants, and you're expected to clean up after them without complaint. When they spill wine on the floor, you clean it. When they track mud through the house, you scrub it away. When they deliberately knock over a water jar because they think it's funny to watch slaves scramble, you pick up the pieces and refill it, smiling gratefully for the privilege. Because that's the thing about household slavery. You're not just expected to work, you're expected to be grateful for it. Your master believes he's doing you a favor by providing you with food and shelter. He expects you to show appreciation for your enslavement, to smile when he beats you, to thank him for the privilege of serving his family. The lady of the house inspects your work with the critical eye of someone who's never done physical labor in her life. She finds fault with everything. The floor isn't clean enough. The bed linens aren't arranged properly. The water jars aren't filled to the correct level. Each criticism comes with a threat of punishment, and those threats are rarely empty. Mid-morning, you're sent to the market to purchase supplies. This should be a relief, a chance to see the outside world, but it's not. You wear a visible marker of your slave status, usually a metal collar or brand, so everyone knows exactly what you are. Free citizens move aside when you approach, not out of politeness, but out of disgust. You're contaminated, subhuman, something to be avoided. The merchants treat you with barely concealed contempt. They assume you're trying to cheat them, that you're too stupid to understand prices, that you're probably stealing. They count the money 3 times, examine every coin suspiciously, and make you wait while they serve free customers first. Back at the house, you're expected to account for every coin, every purchase, every moment of your absence. Your master's wife questions you closely about who you spoke to, what you saw, whether you lingered anywhere you shouldn't have. Because slaves who spend too much time in the outside world start getting ideas. Ideas about freedom, about dignity, about the possibility that life could be different. Lunch preparation begins immediately after the morning shopping. You're grinding grain into flour, a task that leaves your arms screaming and your back permanently bent. You're tending fires that fill the kitchen with smoke and heat. You're preparing elaborate meals for the family while subsisting on scraps, leftovers, and the occasional piece of bread so stale it could be used as a weapon. The afternoon brings more cleaning, more serving, more silent endurance of casual cruelty. The master's friends come to visit, and they amuse themselves by ordering you around unnecessarily. Fetch wine. No, not that wine, the other wine. Move that chair. Actually, move it back. They're not thirsty or uncomfortable. They just enjoy watching you jump to their commands because they can. Evening is when the real torture begins. Because night doesn't bring rest for a household slave. It brings the hours when your owners are home, relaxed, and looking for entertainment. And sometimes, that entertainment involves reminding you exactly how powerless you are. The master's son, a young man barely out of his teens, has taken a particular interest in asserting his authority over the female slaves. Your sleeping quarters echo with muffled sobs that everyone hears and no one acknowledges. Because rape isn't a crime when the victim is property, it's just another way of using your possessions. The master himself drinks heavily in the evenings, and drunk masters are dangerous masters. They become philosophical about slavery, explaining to anyone who'll listen why slaves deserve their fate, why it's actually kindness to keep humans as property, why the gods intended this natural order. These monologues always end the same way, with demonstrations of his absolute power over your body and soul. You lie on your straw mat, listening to the sounds of violence and violation echoing through the slave quarters. You close your eyes and try to remember what freedom felt like, but those memories are already fading. The mind protects itself by forgetting what it can't bear to remember. Tomorrow will bring the same routine, the same brutality disguised as domestic order, the same slow erosion of everything that once made you human. And you're beginning to understand that this isn't temporary. This isn't something you'll eventually escape. This is your life now. This is all the life you'll ever have. The household slave's existence is designed to break your spirit without damaging your utility, your valuable property, so they can't simply beat you to death. Instead, they perfect the art of psychological torture, creating a living hell that preserves your body while destroying your soul. But household slavery, horrific as it is, isn't the worst fate that awaits slaves in ancient Greece. Because if you're unlucky, if you're strong-backed and deemed expendable, there's a place that makes household servitude look like paradise. A place where slaves go to die slowly, painfully, and completely forgotten by the world above. The silver mines of Laurium. The mines at Laurium aren't just a workplace. They're a slow-motion execution chamber designed to extract every ounce of labor from human bodies before discarding them like broken tools. Located about 25 miles southeast of Athens, these tunnels honeycomb the earth like a vast underground cemetery. And that's exactly what they are, a cemetery where the dead just happen to still be breathing. You arrive at Laurium in chains, part of a convoy of slaves who've been deemed expendable. Maybe you were a household slave who tried to escape one too many times. Maybe you were a field worker who got too old to be profitable above ground. Or maybe you were simply unlucky enough to be strong and healthy when the mines needed fresh bodies. The overseer who takes delivery of your chain gang has the look of a man who's stopped seeing slaves as human beings. His eyes are flat, calculating, focused entirely on how much work he can squeeze out of you before your body gives up. He doesn't bother learning your name. You're just a number now, carved into a lead token that hangs around your neck like a miniature tombstone. The descent into the mines is your descent into hell, The entrance shaft drops straight down into darkness, so complete it seems solid. No gradual slope, no gentle introduction to underground work. Just a terrifying plunge on rickety wooden ladders while your chains clank against the stone walls. The air grows colder, damper, heavier with each step down. 50 feet down, 100 feet, 200 feet. The surface world disappears entirely, replaced by a network of tunnels so narrow you have to crawl, so low you can't stand upright, so dark that torches create pools of flickering light surrounded by impenetrable blackness. This is where you'll spend the rest of your life, however long that might be. Your tools are primitive: bronze picks, wooden hammers, wicker baskets for hauling ore. No machinery, no animal power, no technology beyond what humans have used for centuries. Everything depends on muscle, endurance, and the willingness to keep swinging your pick long after your body screams for mercy. The workday begins in darkness and ends in darkness because there is no day down here. Time is measured not in hours, but in quotas. You must fill a certain number of baskets with silver ore or face punishment. Miss your quota, and you don't eat. Miss it repeatedly, and you might not live to see another dawn. The tunnels are barely wide enough for a grown man to squeeze through, and certainly not tall enough to stand in. You spend your entire working life bent double, crawling, contorting your body into positions that human spines weren't designed to maintain. Within weeks, every slave develops a permanent stoop, hunched shoulders, and a shuffling gait that persists even on the rare occasions you're allowed above ground. The ore veins run in every direction, creating a three-dimensional maze of tunnels, shafts, and chambers. Slaves are lowered into narrow shafts on ropes, sometimes 50 or 60 feet down, to chip away at ore faces in spaces so tight they can barely move their arms. If the rope breaks, or the tunnel collapses, you die alone in the dark, and your body might never be recovered. Ventilation is non-existent. The air is thick with stone dust, metallic particles, and the exhalations of hundreds of men working in confined spaces. Every breath you take coats your lungs with grit. Within months, most miners develop a racking cough that never goes away. Within a few years, that cough turns bloody. The lucky ones die quickly from lung disease. The unlucky ones suffocate slowly over years. Water seeps constantly through the rock, creating muddy pools and slippery surfaces. But this isn't clean water. It's contaminated with metals, minerals, and human waste from the levels above. Drinking it makes you sick, not drinking it makes you dead. So you drink it and hope your body can process the poison long enough to meet today's quota. The temperature underground is constant. Cold. Not pleasantly cool, but bone. Deep, soul. Crushing cold that seeps through your thin tunic and settles in your joints. Your hands become so numb you can barely grip your tools. Your feet lose feeling entirely, making it easy to stumble in the dark and injure yourself on the jagged rocks. Food in the mines is calculated to keep you alive and working, nothing more. Barley gruel, stale bread, and water. Sometimes a bit of olive oil, or a handful of dried figs if you've exceeded your quota. But the rations are deliberately insufficient. Hungry slaves work harder, fight less, and die more quietly. Sleep happens in underground barracks carved directly into the rock. Dozens of men crammed into spaces, meant for half that number, lying on stone shelves covered with mouldy straw. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, infected wounds, and human waste. Disease spreads rapidly in these conditions. Dysentery, fever, skin infections that never heal in the damp environment. The psychological impact of mine work is as devastating as the physical toll. You never see the sun. You lose track of time, of seasons, of the passage of days and months. Some slaves go mad from the constant darkness, talking to invisible companions or screaming suddenly in the tunnels. Others retreat so far into themselves that they become like automata, swinging their picks mechanically until their hearts stop. Escape from the mines is virtually impossible. The shafts are too deep, the tunnels too complex, and the surrounding countryside too hostile. Even if you somehow made it to the surface, you'd be immediately recognizable as a mine slave by your pallor, your cough, and your distinctive gait. Recapture means flogging, branding, and potentially being chained permanently to your workstation. The overseers know that mine slaves have limited lifespans, so they extract maximum value while they can. Injured workers who can't meet their quotas are simply left to die. Sick slaves are worked until they collapse. Old slaves are abandoned in played-out tunnels and left to starve in the dark. Your life expectancy as a mine slave is measured in months, not years. The strong might last 2 or 3 years if they're lucky. The weak die in weeks. But during that brief, agonizing existence, you'll produce enough silver to mint thousands of Athenian coins, fund military campaigns, and build the monuments that tourists will admire thousands of years later. The silver you extract with your blood and breath finances the very democracy that keeps you enslaved. Every drachma bears the owl of Athena, goddess of wisdom, struck from metal torn from the earth by human beings who died forgotten in the darkness below. The glory of Athens, the wisdom of its philosophers, the beauty of its art, all purchased with the lives of slaves who never saw sunlight again. And when you finally collapse in those tunnels, when your pick falls from hands too weak to lift it, when your lungs finally give up the fight against stone dust and poison air, your body will be dragged to a pit and covered with lime. No funeral, no marker, no memory. Just another dead slave in the foundation of Greek civilization. But even the mines aren't the final circle of this slavery hell. Because for some unfortunates, there's a fate that combines the brutality of mine work with the helplessness of sexual slavery, the impossibility of escape with the constant threat of violence. For those who catch the eye of the wrong master, there's a special kind of bondage that destroys both body and soul. The bedroom of your master isn't a sanctuary. It's a torture chamber where your body becomes the instrument of someone else's pleasure, and your consent is a concept that doesn't exist. Sexual slavery in ancient Greece wasn't hidden or shameful. It was open, legal, and considered a natural right of ownership. When you buy a slave, you buy their body, all of it, for whatever purpose you choose. If you're young, attractive, or simply available, you quickly learn that household duties are only part of your obligations. Your real job is to provide sexual services to whoever your owner decides. This might be the master himself, his sons, his friends, or even guests who are entertained with the use of his property. You are a living sex toy, passed around like wine at a symposium. The master's bedroom becomes familiar in ways that haunt your dreams. You know every texture of the bed coverings, every shadow cast by the oil lamps, every sound the wooden bed frame makes under the weight of violence. You learn to dissociate, to let your mind float away while your body endures whatever is demanded of it. Refusal isn't an option. Slaves who resist sexual demands are beaten, starved, sold to the mines, or simply killed. Your survival depends on compliance, on learning to fake enthusiasm for your own violation, on pretending that serving your master's lusts is a privilege rather than a nightmare. The master's wife knows exactly what happens in that bedroom, and her response isn't sympathy. It's jealousy and rage, directed entirely at you. She sees you as competition for her husband's attention, not as a victim of his abuse. She makes your daily life miserable in petty ways. Extra work, reduced food, sleeping assignments in the coldest, dampest parts of the house. The master's sons view you as practice for their future relationships with their own slaves. They're learning dominance, learning to see sexual violence as a normal part of male privilege. Your suffering teaches them that some human beings exist solely for the pleasure of others. You're not just being abused. You're being used to train the next generation of abusers. Male slaves face sexual violence too, though it's discussed even less openly. Young men and boys are routinely used by their masters and the master's friends. In Greek culture, sexual relationships between older and younger males are not only accepted but considered educational. The fact that the younger participant is enslaved, unable to consent, and often unwilling, is irrelevant to masters who see rape as their right. The psychological damage of sexual slavery is profound and permanent. You learn to hate your own body, to see it as the source of your suffering rather than something that belongs to you. You develop elaborate mental strategies for surviving violation, imagining you're somewhere else, counting stones in the wall. reciting prayers to gods who never answer. Pregnancy, for female slaves, is both a threat and a potential salvation. A pregnant slave is more valuable and might receive slightly better treatment to protect the master's investment. But childbirth for slaves is dangerous, with no medical care beyond what other slaves can provide. Many don't survive, and those who do face the horror of watching their children grow up in the same bondage. The children born to slave mothers become the next generation of property. They're often sold away from their mothers at young ages, sometimes to different cities where they'll never be found. The grief of losing a child to slavery breaks something fundamental in the human spirit, leaving mothers as walking shells of themselves. Some masters develop what they think of as affection for their sexual slaves. But this isn't love or even kindness. It's the possessiveness of someone who's found a particularly satisfying toy. Such favored slaves might receive better clothing, more food, or gifts of jewelry. But these perks come with expectations of gratitude and exclusivity that make the bondage even more complete. The worst part of sexual slavery might be the way it isolates you from other slaves. Household slaves often resent those who receive special treatment, even when that treatment is rape. You're seen as lucky, privileged, chosen. The fact that this privilege is actually ongoing sexual violence gets lost in the jealousy and desperation of people fighting for scraps of humanity. You learn to navigate the complex hierarchy of abuse that exists in every Greek household. The cook might have more day-to-day authority than the sexual slaves, but she's also more likely to be sold if she displeases the mistress. The door slaves have more mobility, but are also more likely to be suspected of planning escape. Everyone is trapped, but in different ways. And those differences create divisions that prevent solidarity. The Masters' Symposiums are particular nightmares for sexual slaves. These drinking parties, where Greek men gather to discuss philosophy and politics, regularly feature slave entertainment. You might be expected to dance naked, perform sexual acts with other slaves for the amusement of the guests, or service multiple men throughout the evening. The same men who debate the nature of justice and virtue think nothing of using human beings as living pornography. Religious festivals offer no respite. In fact, some religious celebrations involve ritual sexual activities, where slaves are used to honor certain gods. Your violation becomes a sacred act, blessed by priests and witnessed by the community. The very gods that your masters claim to worship become complicit in your degradation. The legal system offers no protection because you have no legal standing. You can't testify against a free person, can't own property, can't enter into contracts. If your master kills you in a fit of rage, he might have to pay a fine to the state for destroying property. But there's no murder charge, no justice, no recognition that a human life has been lost. Some sexual slaves develop Stockholm syndrome, identifying with their captors and believing they deserve their fate. This psychological defense mechanism helps them survive, but it also makes escape psychologically impossible even when it might be physically feasible. They've been so thoroughly broken that freedom becomes unimaginable. The aging process for sexual slaves is particularly cruel. As your youth and attractiveness fade, your value to your master decreases. Older sexual slaves are often relegated to harder labor or sold to less desirable situations. The very attributes that made you valuable also ensure that your bondage will become progressively worse as time passes. Death sometimes seems like the only escape, but even suicide is difficult for slaves. You're watched constantly, kept away from weapons or poisons, and any suicide attempt that fails results in severe punishment. Some slaves try to provoke their masters into killing them, but even this form of escape requires a kind of courage that years of abuse have typically destroyed. The sexual slavery system in ancient Greece wasn't an aberration or a shameful secret. It was integral to the social order, openly practiced and legally protected. The same culture that gave us democracy and philosophy also gave us the normalization of rape, the commodification of human sexuality, and the creation of human beings whose only purpose was to satisfy the appetites of their owners. This is the hidden foundation of Greek civilization. Not just economic slavery, but sexual slavery that turned human bodies into commodities and human dignity into a luxury reserved for the free. Every philosophical dialogue, every democratic debate, every artistic achievement was built on this bedrock of normalized sexual violence. But there was one form of slavery that might have been even worse than the mines or the bedroom, one that took strong young men and turned them into killing machines for the entertainment of crowds who cheered for their deaths. Gladiatorial slavery. Actually, wait, that was Rome. Greeks had something different but equally horrifying for their warrior slaves. They turned them into hoplites, heavy infantry expected to fight and die in phalanx formations for the very people who enslaved them. Imagine being forced to carry a spear in defense of a city that considers you subhuman, fighting beside free citizens who see you as expendable tools. But that's not quite right either. Greek military slaves were more often used as light troops, skirmishers, or support personnel. The real warrior hell for Greek slaves was different, more personal, and infinitely more degrading. It was being a wrestling slave, a pancration fighter, or a boxer whose only value lay in providing violent entertainment while absorbing punishment that would cripple or kill normal men. These athletic slaves were trained not for war, but for spectacle, conditioned to inflict and endure violence for the amusement of free citizens who bet on their pain. The gymnasium where you train isn't a place of noble athletic pursuit. It's a factory for producing damaged human beings who can entertain crowds with their suffering. You wake each morning knowing that your body is being systematically destroyed in service of someone else's entertainment and profit. Your trainer, himself often a former slave fighter who survived long enough to be useful in other ways, works your body like a piece of metal being forged. Every exercise is designed to increase your pain tolerance, your ability to absorb punishment, your willingness to inflict damage on other human beings who are just as trapped as you are. The training regimen is brutal beyond imagination. Hours of conditioning that leave your skin raw and your muscles screaming. Sparring sessions where you're expected to injure your training partners severely enough to test your techniques, but not so severely that they can't train tomorrow. It's a delicate balance of controlled violence that requires you to become an expert in calibrated brutality. Your diet is carefully controlled to build muscle while keeping you desperate. Enough protein to maintain strength, not enough calories to feel satisfied. Hunger keeps you aggressive, focused, willing to fight harder for the promise of extra rations. Well-fed slaves are complacent slaves, and complacent slaves don't provide good entertainment. The weapons training is particularly horrifying because you're learning to kill with your bare hands, or with implements designed to maximize spectacle rather than efficiency. Boxing slaves train with leather cestus's studded with metal. Wrestling slaves learn techniques designed to break bones slowly rather than quickly. Pancration fighters practice moves that cause maximum pain while keeping opponents conscious and fighting. Competition day arrives with the sick excitement of a public execution, which is essentially what it is. You're paraded through the streets like a prize bull, oiled and displayed for the betting crowds who wager on which parts of your body will be broken first. The arena fills with citizens who've paid good money to watch human beings destroy each other for sport. The fight itself is a nightmare of controlled violence. You're not trying to win quickly or efficiently. You're trying to provide entertainment value to make the crowd feel they've gotten their money's worth. That means prolonging the violence, making it spectacular, ensuring that both fighters absorb enough damage to satisfy the bloodlust of free citizens looking for excitement. Victory brings rewards. Better food, softer bedding, perhaps medical attention for your injuries. But victory also means you'll fight again, that your body will be subjected to this process repeatedly until it finally gives out. Each win is just another step toward inevitable destruction, another delay before the accumulated damage makes you unable to continue. Defeat might mean death, depending on the whims of the crowd and the value your owner places on keeping you alive. Even if you survive, serious injury means you're no longer useful as a fighter. Crippled athletic slaves are often sold to the mines or put to harder labor until their damaged bodies give out entirely. The crowd's reaction to your pain is perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of athletic slavery. Free citizens who would never personally harm a fly cheer wildly when your bones break, when blood streams down your face, when you scream in agony from techniques designed to cause maximum suffering. Your pain is their entertainment, your degradation their pleasure. Between fights, you're kept in conditions that ensure you remain desperate enough to fight hard. Poor food, uncomfortable quarters, constant reminders that your life depends entirely on your ability to entertain people who see you as less than human. You can't form relationships with other fighter slaves, because tomorrow you might be ordered to cripple them for sport. The medical care you receive is designed to keep you functional as a fighter, not to heal you properly. Broken bones are set quickly and carelessly. Cuts are stitched to prevent infection, but not to avoid scarring. Internal injuries are ignored unless they threaten your immediate fighting ability. Your body becomes a map of violence, each scar a reminder of entertainment provided to people who bought tickets to watch you suffer. Retirement from athletic slavery isn't a gentle transition to easier work. It's a sudden drop from valuable entertainment to worthless burden. Former fighters who survive long enough to become unable to compete are often abandoned, sold to harsh labor situations, or simply left to die. The same crowds who cheered for you won't spare a thought for your welfare once you can no longer provide spectacle. The psychological transformation required to survive as an athletic slave is profound and disturbing. You must learn to find satisfaction in violence, to take pride in your ability to inflict and endure pain, to see other human beings as obstacles to your survival rather than fellow sufferers. The process turns you into someone you wouldn't recognize, someone capable of terrible things in service of your own desperate need to live another day. But even athletic slavery, degrading and violent as it is, pales in comparison to what awaits those unfortunate enough to be born into the most psychologically devastating form of Greek bondage. Hereditary slavery, where children are raised from birth to see their own enslavement as natural, proper, and deserved. These children never know freedom, never experience dignity, never learn that their lives have intrinsic value beyond their utility to others. They're raised to be perfect slaves, obedient, grateful, and completely unable to imagine any other way of existing. This is where Greek slavery reveals its most insidious evil. Not just the enslavement of bodies, but the enslavement of minds. The creation of human beings who participate willingly in their own degradation because they've never been taught that they deserve anything better. The child born into slavery never experiences the shock of losing freedom because they never had it to lose. They emerge into the world as property, raised by mothers who whisper desperate lullabies about accepting fate, and fathers who may not even know they exist. These children are perhaps the most tragic victims of the Greek slavery system because they're trained from birth to collaborate in their own oppression. Your earliest memories are of being taught to bow your head when free people approach, to speak only when spoken to accept punishment without question or complaint. You learn to read the moods of your owners like your life depends on it, because it does. A master's frown might mean a beating. A mistress's irritation might mean no food for a day. Your survival depends on becoming an expert in the emotions of people who own you. The slave child's education is carefully designed to crush independence while building useful skills. You learn to read, but only so you can manage household accounts or carry messages. You learn to calculate, but only to count inventory or measure out rations. You learn languages, but only to translate for your master's business dealings. Every skill you acquire serves someone else's purpose, never your own. You're taught to see free people as fundamentally different from yourself, almost like a different species. They're naturally suited for leadership, decision-making, and complex thought. You're naturally suited for obedience, service, and simple tasks. This isn't presented as unfair or cruel. It's presented as the natural order, as divinely ordained as the rising of the sun. The slave quarters become your entire universe. You rarely leave the master's property, and when you do, it's always under supervision and for specific purposes. Your understanding of the wider world comes through fragments, overheard conversations, glimpses through doorways, stories told by other slaves who've served different masters. You have no context for understanding that other ways of life exist. Play, for slave children, is always preparation for work. Games involve practicing household tasks, competing to see who can carry water fastest or clean most efficiently. Toys are rare and usually broken or discarded items from the master's children. Entertainment is storytelling in the slave quarters, usually tales that reinforce the virtues of obedience, hard work, and acceptance of one's fate. The relationship with the master's children is particularly complex and psychologically damaging. You might grow up alongside free children, sharing some activities, and even developing what feels like friendship. But there's always an underlying awareness that they will grow up to own people like you, that the affection they show now is temporary and conditional. As you approach adolescence, the casual equality of childhood games disappears entirely. The master's son, who might have been your playmate yesterday, suddenly becomes your superior, who can order you around with impunity. The master's daughter, who might have shared secrets with you, now treats you as furniture, useful but invisible. Sexual maturity for hereditary slaves brings new horrors. Young girls learn that their bodies don't belong to them, that sexual service is just another household duty expected of them. Young boys discover that their physical development makes them valuable in new and degrading ways. The awakening of adult desires becomes corrupted by the reality that you'll never have consensual relationships, only arrangements made by your owners. Marriage between slaves requires the master's permission and can be dissolved at his whim. Any children born from such unions belong to the master, not to their parents. You might be allowed to live with your partner and children, or they might be sold to different owners at any time. Love becomes a luxury you can't afford, because attachment only increases your suffering when separations are inevitable. The hereditary slave develops a particular kind of broken psychology, different from those enslaved later in life. Instead of mourning lost freedom, you mourn something you can't even name. There's a persistent sense that something is missing from your life, but you lack the vocabulary or experience to identify what that might be. It's like being born colorblind and trying to understand descriptions of color. Religious instruction for slave children focuses heavily on divine justice, cosmic order, and the virtue of accepting your assigned role in life. You're taught that the gods have placed you in slavery for good reasons, that rebellion against your condition is rebellion against divine will, that suffering in this life will be rewarded in the next if you're sufficiently obedient. The most psychologically devastating aspect of hereditary slavery might be the way it corrupts basic human relationships. You learn to love people who own you, to feel grateful for basic necessities, to see kindness and cruelty as equally deserved. Your emotional development becomes twisted around the needs and whims of your owners. As hereditary slaves reach adulthood, they often become the most trusted and valuable property because they're completely psychologically broken. They police other slaves, report escape attempts, and enforce the master's will with more dedication than hired overseers. They've been so thoroughly conditioned that they genuinely believe their slavery serves everyone's best interests. Some hereditary slaves are eventually manumitted, granted freedom as a reward for lifetime service. But freedom for someone raised in slavery is often more curse than blessing. They have no idea how to make independent decisions, how to manage money, how to form relationships based on equality rather than ownership. Many freed hereditary slaves end up returning to their former masters, begging to be taken back into bondage. The children of hereditary slaves often suffer even more than their parents because they're raised by people who've been completely broken by the system. These parents, desperate to protect their children from punishment, teach them to be even more obedient, more self-effacing, more accepting of abuse. Each generation becomes more perfectly enslaved than the last. But even the most psychologically broken slaves sometimes experience moments of clarity, brief flashes of awareness that their condition isn't natural or deserved. These moments are dangerous because they threaten the careful conditioning that keeps the slavery system stable. When such awareness spreads, when slaves begin to remember their humanity, resistance becomes possible. And resistance, when it comes, is met with punishments so severe they're designed to terrorize not just the rebels but every slave who hears about them. The punishment of rebellious slaves isn't just about stopping individual acts of defiance. It's about creating terror so profound that the very thought of resistance becomes unbearable. Greek masters understand that their power depends not just on physical control but on psychological domination, and their methods of punishment are designed to destroy both body and spirit. The discovery of an escape attempt begins with interrogation. not questioning, interrogation. You're stripped naked and chained in uncomfortable positions while overseers, and sometimes the master himself, demand to know every detail of your plan. Who helped you? Who else knew? Who can't be trusted? The questioning continues until they're satisfied they've identified every possible collaborator or sympathizer. The physical torture during interrogation is methodical and designed to maximize pain while avoiding death. Whipping with leather straps embedded with metal studs, burning with heated metal implements, joint dislocation and bone breaking in carefully controlled ways. The goal isn't confession, because your guilt is assumed. The goal is information and intimidation. Other slaves are forced to watch these interrogations. They're not allowed to look away, to close their eyes, or to show sympathy for the victim. Any sign of emotional response to the torture results in the observer being added to the punishment list. You learn to watch your fellow slaves being destroyed while maintaining an expression of detached interest. And this forced complicity breaks something fundamental in your humanity. The actual punishment for attempted escape varies depending on your value and your master's mood, but it's always public and always designed to be remembered. Branding is common, not just marking you as a runaway, but creating permanent disfigurement that will remind everyone of your shame. The brands are applied to visible areas: face, forehead, hands, arms. You become a walking advertisement for the consequences of defiance. Hamstringing is reserved for valuable slaves who can't simply be killed. The tendons in your ankles are severed, permanently crippling you, but leaving you able to work while making escape impossible. You'll spend the rest of your life dragging useless feet behind you, a constant reminder to yourself and others of what happens when slaves dream of freedom. Crucifixion, borrowed from other cultures, is used for the most serious offenses or the most worthless slaves. You're nailed to wooden posts and left to die slowly over days while other slaves are marched past to observe your agony. The process is designed to be as prolonged and visible as possible, a living demonstration of your master's absolute power over life and death. Mass punishments follow major rebellions or widespread unrest. Even slaves who weren't directly involved in resistance are flogged, branded, or killed to ensure that the entire slave population understands the consequences of collective action. The message is clear. You're responsible not just for your own behavior, but for the behavior of every slave around you. Sexual torture is routine for female slaves suspected of rebellion. Rape becomes not just exploitation, but punishment, carried out publicly or semi-publicly to maximize humiliation. Male slaves face genital mutilation, castration, or sexual assault designed to emasculate and degrade them. The violation of your most intimate self becomes a tool of control. Starvation is used as both punishment and interrogation technique. Suspected rebels are denied food until they're too weak to resist further questioning. Their slow deterioration serves as entertainment for guards and education for other slaves. You learn to watch fellow human beings waste away while feeling grateful that you're still being fed. The punishment of slave families is particularly cruel. If you attempt escape, your children might be sold to the mines while you're forced to watch. Your spouse might be given to other slaves as a breeding partner. Your parents might be worked to death in retaliation for your defiance. Every relationship you care about becomes a weapon that can be used against you. Psychological torture complements physical punishment. Rebels are forced to participate in the punishment of other slaves, turning victims into collaborators. You might be ordered to whip a fellow escapee, or to brand a friend who helped you. Refusal means death. Compliance means the destruction of your soul and any possibility of solidarity with other slaves. The cleanup after punishment is deliberately assigned to slaves who weren't involved in the original offense. You're forced to dispose of the bodies, clean up the blood, and repair any damage caused by the torture. This creates a direct connection between rebellion and extra work for innocent slaves, fostering resentment against those who dare to resist. Recovery from punishment is slow and deliberately inadequate. Medical attention is minimal, designed to keep you alive and working, but not to heal properly. Infected wounds, improperly set bones, and untreated injuries serve as permanent reminders of your punishment. Your damaged body becomes a walking testament to your master's power. The psychological effect of witnessing punishment is as damaging as experiencing it directly. You develop hypervigilance, constantly watching for signs that you or others might be suspected of rebellion. You learn to suppress natural human emotions like sympathy, anger, or hope, because expressing them might be interpreted as dangerous. Sleep becomes difficult after punishment sessions because your dreams are filled with images of torture and death. You wake up screaming or in cold sweats, and this sleep deprivation makes you more compliant, less able to think clearly, more susceptible to the psychological conditioning that keeps you enslaved. Some slaves break completely under the terror of punishment, developing what we might now recognize as severe PTSD. They become unable to function normally, jumping at shadows, crying uncontrollably, or retreating into catatonic states. These broken slaves are usually sold cheaply to situations where their damaged state doesn't matter, like the mines. The most insidious aspect of the punishment system is how it turns slaves against each other. Reporting suspicious behavior becomes a survival strategy. Avoiding association with potential rebels becomes necessary self-preservation. The natural human tendency to form bonds and support each other is corrupted into a system of mutual surveillance and betrayal. Even masters who pride themselves on being kind or philosophical participate in this system of terror. The brutal punishment of rebellious slaves is seen as necessary maintenance, like sharpening tools or repairing roofs. It's not personal cruelty. It's rational management of valuable property. The legal system reinforces these brutal punishment practices by treating slave rebellion as property damage rather than human resistance. Masters who kill runaway slaves aren't committing murder. They're disposing of defective equipment. The state might fine them for waste if the slave was particularly valuable, but there's no moral or legal condemnation of the violence itself. But perhaps the most horrifying aspect of Greek slavery isn't the individual cruelties inflicted on particular slaves. It's the way the entire system is woven into the fabric of society, making every citizen complicit in mass human suffering while allowing them to maintain their sense of moral superiority. The economy of ancient Greece doesn't just benefit from slavery. It depends on it absolutely. Remove the slaves, and the entire civilization collapses overnight. Every philosophical dialogue, every democratic debate, every artistic achievement exists only because enslaved human beings are performing the labor that makes free time possible for citizens. The silver that finances Athens' golden age comes directly from the blood and lungs of mine slaves who die forgotten in tunnels beneath the earth. Every drachma in circulation represents not just economic value but human suffering measured in whip marks, broken bones, and stopped hearts. The beautiful coins with their owls and goddesses are literally stamped from the lives of enslaved people. Agriculture in Greece is entirely dependent on slave labor. The olive groves that produce Athens' liquid gold are tended by men and women who will never taste the oil they create. The grain fields that feed the cities are worked by people who subsist on scraps while their labor fills the granaries of their owners. Free citizens debate the virtues of different foods while slaves grow, harvest, and prepare everything they eat. Manufacturing and crafts rely heavily on enslaved artisans whose skills generate wealth for masters who may not understand the techniques involved. Pottery, metalwork, textile production, shipbuilding, all these industries that make Greek cities prosperous depend on the knowledge and labor of people who own nothing, not even the tools they use or the products they create. Construction of temples, public buildings, and private homes is accomplished almost entirely by slave labor. The Parthenon, that symbol of democratic achievement and artistic excellence, was built by men in chains, working under the threat of whips. Every marble column was lifted by slaves. Every sculptural detail carved by enslaved artists. Every architectural innovation implemented by human beings treated as living tools. The domestic economy of every Greek household revolves around unpaid slave labor. Cooking, cleaning, childcare, estate management, all the work that makes civilized life possible is performed by people whose own needs are ignored. Free women manage households by commanding enslaved women. Free men conduct business using enslaved accountants and scribes. Military campaigns are supported by thousands of slaves who carry supplies, build camps, tend weapons, and perform all the unglamorous labor that makes warfare possible. Ironically, these slaves enable Greek armies to fight for concepts like freedom and democracy while remaining enslaved themselves. The Persian Wars, celebrated as the triumph of liberty over tyranny, were won partly through the labor of people who had no liberty at all. The intellectual achievements of Greek civilization are directly subsidized by slave labor. Philosophers can spend their days thinking about justice and virtue because slaves handle every practical need. Teachers can educate young citizens because enslaved pedagogues manage the daily details of education. Scientists can conduct experiments because enslaved assistants prepare materials and maintain equipment. Trade throughout the Mediterranean depends on enslaved crews, enslaved dock workers, enslaved craftsmen producing goods for export, and enslaved accountants managing the complex financial arrangements involved. Greek merchants become wealthy not through their own labor, but through their ownership of other human beings whose work generates profit. The entertainment industry, from athletic competitions to theatrical performances, relies heavily on enslaved participants. Actors, musicians, dancers, athletes, all frequently slaves whose talents are exploited for the pleasure of free audiences. The cultural achievements that Greeks are proud of often represent the appropriation of enslaved creativity. Banking and finance, crucial to Greek economic development, depend on enslaved clerks, scribes, and accountants who handle the detailed work of managing money and credit. The complex financial instruments that enable trade and investment are administered by people who own nothing and can never benefit from the wealth they help create. The taxation system that funds public works and military campaigns is administered largely by enslaved bureaucrats who collect, count, and record the revenues that support the state. Ironically, the democratic government that excludes them from participation depends on their labor for its basic functioning. Urban planning and infrastructure maintenance rely on gangs of public slaves who build roads, maintain water systems, collect garbage, and perform all the tasks necessary to keep cities functioning. The quality of life enjoyed by free citizens is directly dependent on the labor of people who are excluded from citizenship. Even religious practices involve extensive slave labor. Temples are built and maintained by enslaved workers. Sacrificial animals are prepared by enslaved butchers. Religious festivals are organized and executed by enslaved coordinators. The relationship between Greeks and their gods is mediated by the unpaid labor of people considered spiritually inferior. The legal system itself is administered partly through slave labor. Court records are maintained by enslaved scribes. Legal research is conducted by enslaved scholars. And even some legal procedures involve the forced testimony of slaves obtained through torture. Justice, supposedly the foundation of civilized society, is built on injustice. This economic dependence on slavery creates a moral blindness among free Greeks that's stunning in its completeness. They develop elaborate philosophical justifications for a system that benefits them materially while destroying millions of lives. Aristotle argues that some people are natural slaves, that slavery benefits the enslaved by providing them with purpose and guidance they couldn't achieve independently. The prosperity that slavery generates allows Greeks to see themselves as especially blessed by the gods, especially talented, especially deserving of their privileged position. They interpret their wealth and leisure as evidence of their natural superiority rather than as the product of systematic exploitation. The very success of their slave-based economy becomes proof that slavery is morally justified. Free Greeks develop a psychology of entitlement that makes them incapable of seeing slaves as fully human. The constant availability of enslaved labor makes manual work seem degrading for free people, reinforcing class distinctions and creating a culture that despises the very activities that sustain life. Work becomes associated with slavery, and slaves become associated with subhumanity. The political rhetoric of freedom and democracy takes on a twisted meaning when applied by people who own other human beings. Greeks fight wars to preserve their liberty while enslaving their enemies. They debate the nature of justice while denying basic rights to the majority of people in their society. They celebrate reason while refusing to apply rational moral thinking to their treatment of slaves. Economic dependence on slavery also creates practical obstacles to abolition, even among Greeks who might have moral qualms about the system. The entire society is structured around the assumption of unpaid labor. Freeing the slaves would require completely reorganizing production, redistribution of wealth, and fundamental changes to the social order that few free Greeks are willing to contemplate. The international nature of the slave trade means that even individual Greeks who might want to opt out of slavery find it nearly impossible to do so. Slave-produced goods dominate markets. Slave labor subsidizes prices, and slave-owning competitors have significant advantages. Economic pressure forces participation in a system that might be morally repugnant to some individuals. But perhaps the most damning aspect of Greek economic dependence on slavery is how it corrupts the very ideals that Greeks claim to represent. Democracy becomes a system for organizing the exploitation of non-citizens. Philosophy becomes a tool for justifying oppression. Art becomes propaganda for a way of life built on human suffering. The glory of Greece reveals itself as a beautiful mask covering a foundation of bones. And yet, despite the overwhelming power of this system, despite the economic incentives, the social pressure, and the brutal punishments, some slaves still resist. They find ways to preserve their humanity, to maintain hope, to fight back against a system designed to destroy them completely. Resistance takes many forms, from small daily acts of defiance to organized rebellions that shake the foundations of Greek society. And each act of resistance, no matter how small, represents a victory of the human spirit over a system designed to crush it entirely. In the suffocating world of Greek slavery, resistance isn't just rebellion. It's an affirmation of humanity in a system designed to deny it. Every act of defiance, from the smallest gesture to organized revolt, represents a slave's refusal to accept that they deserve their fate. And the variety of resistance strategies reveals the creativity and courage of people fighting for their souls under impossible circumstances. The most common form of resistance is work slowdown. You can't be fast enough, strong enough, or efficient enough to satisfy masters who see you as a machine. So you learn to control the pace of work in subtle ways that are difficult to detect or punish. Tools break more often when you're using them. Tasks take longer than they should. Accidents happen with suspicious frequency. It's not dramatic, but it's a way of asserting some control over your labor and your life. Feigning illness becomes an art form among slaves. You learn to simulate symptoms convincingly enough to avoid work without appearing healthy enough to be suspected of malingering. Stomach troubles, headaches, joint pain, all conditions that are hard to verify but can provide temporary relief from the worst assignments. The key is making your illness believable, without making it serious enough to justify medical attention that might expose the deception. Sabotage of property and equipment offers a way to strike back at masters without directly confronting them. Grain stores develop mysterious infestations. Olive oil somehow spoils faster than it should. Tools become dull or damaged with alarming regularity. Water systems develop leaks that are difficult to locate. Wine turns to vinegar, despite careful storage. Each incident can be blamed on bad luck or natural causes, but the cumulative effect costs masters money and creates constant frustration. Information becomes a weapon in the hands of enslaved household staff who overhear conversations, read correspondence, and observe private behaviors. Strategic leaks of embarrassing or damaging information about masters can cause social problems, business difficulties, or political troubles. The key is ensuring that the information reaches its intended targets without being traceable back to its source. Theft, while risky, offers both practical benefits and psychological satisfaction. Small items that won't be immediately missed. Food, coins, tools, clothing. The goal isn't usually personal enrichment, but rather the satisfaction of taking something back from people who have taken everything from you. Stolen food might be shared with other slaves. Stolen money might fund escape attempts. Stolen tools might be hidden for future use. Sexual resistance among female slaves takes many forms. Contraceptive knowledge, passed down secretly among enslaved women, helps prevent pregnancies that would benefit masters. Cosmetic sabotage makes slaves less attractive to masters seeking sexual pleasure. Transmitted diseases, whether intentionally or accidentally acquired, can make sexual slavery less appealing to owners. These strategies are dangerous, but represent desperate attempts to maintain some control over their own bodies. Communication networks among slaves develop their own languages, codes, and symbols that allow information to flow while evading detection by overseers. Songs that sound like harmless entertainment carry messages about escape routes, sympathetic free people, or planned resistance activities. Religious gatherings become cover for organizing meetings. Work assignments become opportunities to pass information between households and cities. Collaboration with sympathetic free people, while rare, does occasionally occur. Some merchants can be bribed to carry messages. Some philosophers who preach about human dignity might occasionally act on their beliefs. Some citizens who have fallen on hard times might be willing to help in exchange for payment or favors. These relationships are extremely dangerous, but can provide crucial assistance for escape attempts or communication with the outside world. Preservation of cultural identity becomes a form of resistance for slaves taken from other regions. Maintaining traditional songs, stories, religious practices, or languages helps preserve a sense of self that slavery tries to destroy. These cultural practices also help create bonds among slaves from similar backgrounds and maintain hope that life could be different. Documentation of abuses, when possible, serves both immediate and long-term resistance goals. Enslaved scribes might keep secret records of particularly brutal punishments, illegal activities by masters, or information that could be used for blackmail. Even slaves who can't write might memorize important information that could be useful later. Knowledge becomes a form of power, even for the powerless. Protection of other slaves, especially children and new arrivals, helps maintain humanity in an inhumane system. Teaching survival skills, sharing food, providing emotional support, warning about dangerous masters or overseers. All these activities help create solidarity and preserve moral values that slavery tries to destroy. Protecting others also helps maintain a sense of purpose and dignity. Escape attempts, while usually unsuccessful and always dangerous, represent the ultimate expression of resistance. The planning required, the risks involved, and the courage needed make every escape attempt a heroic act, regardless of its outcome. Even failed escapes serve resistance goals by inspiring other slaves, consuming master resources, and demonstrating that the spirit of freedom can never be completely crushed. Religious resistance takes many forms in a society where gods are supposed to support the existing order. Secret worship of gods associated with freedom or justice. Reinterpretation of official religious teachings to emphasize human dignity and divine justice. Development of underground religious movements that promise liberation in this world rather than just the next. These spiritual forms of resistance help maintain hope and provide moral frameworks for opposition to slavery. Organized rebellion, while rare, represents the most dramatic form of resistance. These require extensive planning, careful recruitment, and enormous courage because discovery means torture and death for all participants. Most organized resistance efforts are discovered and crushed before they can achieve their goals, but they serve important symbolic functions and occasionally achieve temporary successes that inspire future resistance. Suicide and self-harm, while tragic, represent a form of resistance when they're chosen as alternatives to continued slavery. The decision to choose death over bondage denies masters the value of their property and asserts the slaves' ultimate control over their own fate. Mass suicides among newly enslaved populations serve as powerful statements about the preferability of death to slavery. Legal resistance involves using the limited legal protections available to slaves or finding ways to manipulate legal processes to achieve better outcomes. This might involve appealing to religious authorities, seeking intervention from sympathetic officials, or exploiting technical legal requirements that masters have failed to meet. While rarely successful, legal resistance can occasionally achieve minor improvements or delays in punishment. Economic resistance involves finding ways to undermine the profitability of slavery through coordinated action. Work slowdowns that affect productivity. Coordinated theft that increases security costs. Sabotage that requires expensive repairs. While individual slaves can't significantly impact the economics of slavery, Coordinated resistance by many slaves can create meaningful financial pressure. The psychology of resistance involves maintaining mental and emotional independence, even when physical freedom is impossible, refusing to internalize the ideology of slavery, maintaining dignity and self-respect despite daily humiliation, preserving hope for a better future despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. These internal forms of resistance may be invisible to masters, but are crucial for maintaining humanity under dehumanizing conditions. Each form of resistance carries enormous risks. Discovery means punishment that's designed to be worse than death. But the mere existence of resistance activities proves that slavery, no matter how brutal, cannot completely destroy the human spirit. Every act of defiance, no matter how small, represents a victory for human dignity over systemic oppression. The master's response to resistance reveals their own deep insecurity about the moral foundations of their society. The elaborate surveillance systems, the brutal punishments, the psychological warfare, all demonstrate that they know their power depends on terror rather than justice. Their fear of slave resistance exposes the fundamental weakness of a system built on the denial of basic human rights. But resistance also reveals something else. The incredible strength and creativity of people fighting for their humanity under impossible circumstances in a world designed to crush their spirits. Slaves find ways to maintain hope, preserve dignity, and fight back against their oppressors. Their resistance proves that no system of oppression, no matter how powerful, can completely destroy the human desire for freedom. And sometimes, very rarely, that resistance achieves something remarkable, actual escape from the hell of Greek slavery. But freedom for an escaped slave isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of a different kind of nightmare, one where former slaves must navigate a world that considers them inherently criminal and dangerous. The moment you decide to escape, you cross a line from which there's no return. Even if you're recaptured, even if you never make it past the city walls, the decision itself changes you. You've chosen hope over safety, freedom over survival, dignity over submission. That choice, regardless of its outcome, is an act of profound courage in a world designed to make courage impossible. Planning an escape requires skills that slavery actively tries to prevent you from developing. You need to understand geography beyond your master's property. You need to know about roads, distances, safe places to hide. You need information about other cities, foreign countries, or distant regions where escaped slaves might find sanctuary. Gathering this knowledge, without arousing suspicion, becomes your secret education. The logistics of escape are staggeringly difficult. You need supplies for a journey of unknown length through hostile territory, food that won't spoil, water containers, clothing suitable for travel, tools for self-defense or survival. All of this must be acquired and hidden without detection. A single discovered cache of escape supplies means torture and death. Timing your escape attempt requires detailed knowledge of your master's routines, the habits of guards and overseers, the patterns of daily life in the household. You need to identify moments when your absence won't be immediately noticed, when security is relaxed, when distractions might provide cover for your departure. These opportunities are rare and fleeting. The moment of actual escape is terrifying beyond description. Every step away from your master's property increases your danger. Every person you encounter might recognize you as an escaped slave. Every sound might be pursuit beginning. Your heart pounds so loudly you're convinced everyone can hear it. Your hands shake so violently you can barely manage simple tasks like opening gates or climbing walls. Navigation becomes your first survival challenge. Most slaves have never traveled more than a few miles from their master's property. The world beyond is largely unknown territory, filled with natural hazards, wild animals, bandits, and slave hunters. Roads that lead nowhere. Paths that end in cliffs or rivers. Forests that are easy to enter but impossible to escape. Getting lost doesn't just delay your journey, it kills you. Hunger becomes your constant companion. You can't enter markets or approach travelers for food because your slave status is immediately visible. Foraging requires knowledge most slaves don't possess. Hunting requires tools and skills you likely don't have. Stealing food from farms or travelers increases your chances of capture. You subsist on scraps, wild plants, and whatever small animals you can catch with your bare hands. Weather becomes a deadly enemy when you lack proper shelter. Rain soaks through your thin clothing and stays there. Cold penetrates to your bones because you can't build fires that might attract attention. Heat exhausts you because you can't rest during the day when pursuit is most likely. Storms force you to seek shelter in caves, under rocks, or in whatever inadequate cover you can find. Sleep becomes a luxury you can't afford. Resting during daylight makes you visible to searchers. Sleeping at night leaves you vulnerable to animals, bandits, and surprise capture. You learn to doze fitfully while walking, to rest in shifts if you're traveling with others, to find hiding places where you can close your eyes for an hour without dying. Injuries and illnesses that would be minor inconveniences in normal circumstances become life-threatening emergencies for escaped slaves. A twisted ankle slows you down when speed is survival. A fever weakens you when strength means everything. An infected cut can kill you when you have no access to medical care. Your body becomes both your vehicle to freedom and your greatest liability. The psychological pressure of being hunted is unlike anything else in human experience. Professional slave hunters are tracking you using dogs trained to follow human scent. Local residents are watching for suspicious strangers. Officials in every city have your description and the reward amount. The entire society is mobilized against your freedom. You develop a paranoia that keeps you alive but slowly drives you insane. Trust becomes impossible when anyone might betray you for reward money. That farmer who offers you work might be planning to turn you in. That traveler who shares food with you might be memorizing your appearance. That fellow slave you encounter might be an informant seeking better treatment for cooperation. Isolation becomes safety. But isolation also means vulnerability. Rivers and mountains present obstacles that can stop escape attempts entirely. You can't hire boats or guides. You can't purchase climbing equipment or maps. You must find your own ways across or around natural barriers using nothing but determination and improvised solutions. Many escapes end at uncrossable rivers or impassable mountain ranges. Urban areas are particularly dangerous because they concentrate the people most likely to recognize and report escaped slaves. But cities also offer the best opportunities for hiding, finding work, or making contact with people who might help. Navigating urban environments requires skills most rural slaves don't possess and knowledge about city customs they've never been taught. Border regions offer the hope of escape from Greek territories. But they're also the most heavily patrolled areas. Soldiers, guards, and professional slave hunters concentrate their efforts on routes leading to foreign countries. The closer you get to potential freedom, the more dangerous your situation becomes. Even successful escape from immediate pursuit doesn't mean safety. You must find a place to live, a way to earn money, and a new identity that won't arouse suspicion. In most cases, this means finding employment with people who ask few questions and pay little money. Former slaves often end up in situations that are only marginally better than slavery itself. The constant fear of recapture never disappears entirely. Years after a successful escape, former slaves jump at unexpected sounds, avoid crowds where they might be recognized, and maintain emergency plans for rapid departure. Freedom, when achieved, comes with a psychological cost that lasts a lifetime. Legal status in foreign countries doesn't automatically improve for escaped Greek slaves. Many regions have reciprocal agreements for returning fugitive slaves. Others simply don't distinguish between free foreigners and escaped slaves. Legal protection for former slaves is rare and often unreliable. Contact with family members left behind becomes impossible because any communication could be traced back to your location. You must choose between freedom and ever seeing your loved ones again. This isolation is perhaps the cruelest aspect of successful escape, achieving liberty while losing everyone who made liberty meaningful. Some escaped slaves attempt to return and rescue family members, but these rescue missions are almost always fatal. The original escape route has been discovered and blocked. Security around remaining family members has been increased. The element of surprise has been lost. Noble intentions usually result in recapture and execution for both the rescuer and the intended rescuees. The few slaves who successfully escape and remain free often find that freedom doesn't automatically restore the humanity that slavery tried to destroy. Years of conditioning, abuse, and trauma don't disappear with geographical distance. Former slaves struggle with self-worth, decision-making, and relationships in ways that can last for generations. Still, every successful escape represents a triumph of human will over systematic oppression. It proves that slavery, no matter how pervasive or brutal, cannot completely extinguish the desire for freedom. Each escaped slave becomes a living contradiction to the ideology that justifies slavery. Proof that enslaved people are capable of the same courage, intelligence, and determination as their former masters. But for the vast majority of slaves who never attempt escape, or whose attempts end in recapture and death, resistance takes other forms. And sometimes, the most powerful resistance comes not from dramatic acts of rebellion, but from simply refusing to let slavery destroy their capacity for love, hope, and human connection. In the end, the question isn't whether slaves resist their condition, it's how they maintain their humanity while doing so. And that may be the most remarkable aspect of the entire story. That people subjected to the most brutal dehumanization in human history still find ways to remain human. Yet even in discussing resistance and escape, we can't lose sight of the fundamental reality. The overwhelming majority of slaves in ancient Greece lived and died in bondage, never experiencing freedom, never escaping their circumstances, never finding relief from the daily grind of systematic exploitation. Their lives were consumed entirely by serving others, and their deaths brought no recognition, no memorial, no acknowledgement that they had ever existed at all. The most devastating aspect of Greek slavery isn't the physical brutality, though that's horrific enough. It's the way the system systematically destroys your ability to think of yourself as human. Every day brings 1,000 small reminders that you're property, not a person. Your name isn't really yours. Your master can change it on a whim. Your relationships aren't really yours. They can be severed by sale or death without your consent. Your thoughts aren't really yours. Expressing them could be interpreted as rebellion deserving punishment. You wake each morning to the same crushing realization. Today will be exactly like yesterday, and tomorrow will be exactly like today, until your body gives out or your mind snaps. There's no vacation, no retirement, no hope of promotion or advancement. Your entire existence is measured not in personal achievements or relationships or experiences, but in your utility to people who see you as breathing equipment. The psychological strategies that slaves developed to survive this mental assault are both remarkable and heartbreaking. You learn to divide your mind into compartments. The part that performs tasks. The part that endures abuse. The part that maintains some small core of self that your masters can't reach. But maintaining these divisions requires constant vigilance and enormous mental energy that leaves you exhausted in ways that physical labor alone never could. Dissociation becomes a survival skill. When your master is raping you, beating you, or forcing you to watch the torture of other slaves, you learn to send your consciousness somewhere else. You're physically present but mentally absent, watching the abuse happen to someone who looks like you but isn't really you. It's a protective mechanism that keeps you sane in the short term but fragments your sense of self in ways that can never fully heal. Memory management becomes crucial for psychological survival. You learn to forget the worst experiences as quickly as possible, while preserving memories of small kindnesses or moments of beauty that help you remember what humanity feels like. But this selective amnesia has costs. You might forget your original name, your family's faces, or important skills from your life before slavery. Your past becomes as much a casualty of slavery as your present. Language itself becomes a battleground for your identity. You're forced to speak in ways that reinforce your subjugation. Always deferential, never assertive, constantly acknowledging your inferior status. Over time, these speech patterns shape how you think about yourself. The words you're allowed to use become the thoughts you're capable of having. Slavery colonizes your very consciousness through the corruption of language. Emotional regulation becomes a matter of life and death. Displaying anger, sadness, or frustration can trigger punishment. Showing too much happiness can be interpreted as insufficiently grateful or potentially rebellious. You must maintain a constant emotional neutrality that satisfies your masters while preserving some inner emotional life they can't monitor. This emotional labor is exhausting and often unsuccessful. Time perception changes fundamentally under slavery. Without control over your schedule, without personal goals or anticipated events, days blur together into an undifferentiated mass of servitude. Seasons matter only insofar as they affect work assignments. Years pass without meaningful markers or achievements. You age without maturing, survive without living, exist without experiencing the passage of time as a meaningful dimension of human existence. Religious and spiritual life becomes complicated when the gods your masters worship are supposedly the same ones who ordained your enslavement. You might develop secret spiritual practices that emphasize your humanity and worth, or you might lose faith entirely, concluding that any universe where slavery exists is fundamentally meaningless. Some slaves find comfort in beliefs about afterlife justice. Others find such beliefs cruel mockeries of their present suffering. Relationship formation becomes a constant balance between the human need for connection and the slave's need for emotional protection. Getting too attached to other slaves means suffering when they're sold, punished, or killed. Maintaining emotional distance protects you from additional pain, but also cuts you off from the human connections that make survival meaningful. Every friendship becomes a calculated risk. Identity maintenance requires enormous creativity and determination. You might secretly practice skills from your pre-slavery life, tell yourself stories about your origins, or maintain cultural traditions in hidden ways. But these identity-preserving activities must be invisible to your masters, who view any sign of independent selfhood as threatening to their control. Your true self becomes an underground resistance movement in your own mind. Physical self-care becomes nearly impossible under slavery, but mental self-care is even more challenging. You have no privacy, no personal space, no time designated for your own needs. Self-compassion becomes a radical act when you're surrounded by messages that you're worthless. Maintaining hope requires an almost superhuman determination to believe in possibilities that seem utterly impossible. The development of what modern psychology might call trauma responses becomes a normal part of slave life. Hypervigilance helps you avoid punishment by reading your master's moods accurately. Emotional numbing protects you from overwhelming pain. Compliance reflexes keep you alive by making submission automatic. These adaptations help you survive slavery, but may make it impossible to function as a free person if freedom ever comes. Sleep, when it comes, offers little relief, because dreams often replay the day's humiliations or project future horrors. Nightmares featuring endless labor, violent punishment, or the death of loved ones become as regular as breathing. Rest becomes another battleground, where your mind struggles to process experiences too terrible for normal psychological mechanisms to handle. The concept of personal choice becomes so foreign that even small decisions become overwhelming. What to eat, where to sleep, when to speak. All these choices are made by others. Over time, you lose the ability to make independent decisions even about trivial matters. This learned helplessness becomes so ingrained that freedom, if it ever comes, can feel more terrifying than reassuring. Body image and self-ownership become corrupted when your physical form belongs to someone else. You learn to see your body as your master sees it. A tool for labor, an object for pleasure, a piece of property to be maintained for maximum utility. The normal human relationship with your own physicality becomes completely distorted, leading to disconnection from bodily sensations and needs. Intellectual development stops or reverses under slavery because independent thinking is discouraged or punished. Your mental capacity might be used for your master's benefit, but your own intellectual curiosity must be suppressed. Questions, analysis, criticism, all the mental activities that define human consciousness become dangerous luxuries you can't afford. Social skills become distorted when all your interactions are based on power imbalances. You learn to read dominance signals, to submit appropriately, to avoid triggering aggression. But you unlearn how to relate to equals, how to negotiate fairly, how to maintain relationships based on mutual respect. Your social development becomes as stunted as your emotional and intellectual growth. The concept of justice becomes impossible to maintain when your daily experience contradicts every principle of fairness and right. You might maintain belief in ultimate cosmic justice, or you might conclude that justice is a myth created by the powerful to pacify the powerless. Either way, your relationship with moral concepts becomes profoundly complicated by the gap between ideals and reality. Future planning becomes meaningless when you have no control over your circumstances. Goals, ambitions, hopes, all the mental activities that orient human consciousness toward the future become sources of pain rather than motivation. You learn to live entirely in the present moment, not through spiritual enlightenment but through desperate necessity. Personal privacy, one of the basic human needs, becomes completely unavailable. Your thoughts, feelings, relationships, and activities are all subject to scrutiny and control. The normal human need for a private inner life becomes a dangerous indulgence that must be carefully hidden. Even your dreams become potentially subversive if they reveal desires for freedom or dignity. The worst part of this psychological destruction might be how it persists even after slavery ends. Former slaves often struggle for years or decades to rebuild their capacity for independent thought, emotional regulation, and social connection. The psychological damage of slavery becomes a form of inherited trauma passed down through generations. Freedom doesn't automatically restore the mental and emotional capacities that slavery systematically destroyed. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about enslaved people is how many of them manage to preserve some core of humanity despite this systematic assault on their psychological integrity. In the darkest corners of the slave quarters, in stolen moments between tasks, in brief exchanges of understanding between fellow sufferers, something irreducibly human persists. It's not much, and it's not enough, but it's there. And that persistence of humanity, that refusal to be completely broken, might be the most powerful form of resistance available to people trapped in systems designed to destroy their souls. Every moment of retained dignity, every act of kindness between slaves, every refusal to internalize completely the ideology of their oppression represents a victory over forces that seem overwhelming. Yet even this psychological resilience comes at enormous cost. The mental energy required to maintain humanity under dehumanizing conditions leaves little capacity for growth, creativity, or joy. Survival becomes the only achievement possible. And survival often requires psychological adaptations that would be considered pathological in normal circumstances. The Greek masters understand the importance of psychological control, which is why their methods of domination go far beyond simple physical coercion. They create elaborate ideological systems to justify slavery, not just to convince free citizens, but to convince slaves themselves that their condition is natural, deserved, and beneficial. This psychological warfare is often more effective than whips and chains in maintaining the slavery system. And the most insidious aspect of this psychological control is how it makes slaves complicit in their own oppression. When you've been conditioned to see yourself as naturally inferior, resistance feels like arrogance. When you've been taught that slavery protects you from your own inadequacies, freedom seems dangerous rather than desirable. The masters don't just control your body, they recruit your mind as an ally in your own enslavement. This is the final, most devastating aspect of Greek slavery. It doesn't just exploit human beings, it convinces them they deserve to be exploited. And that psychological victory is often more complete and longer lasting than any physical conquest could ever be. But even the most sophisticated psychological control can't completely eliminate the human capacity for hope, love, and resistance. And in the small spaces where these qualities survive, slaves create something that their masters can never touch, a different way of being human that transcends the categories of free and enslaved. In the suffocating darkness of slave quarters, when the day's labor is done and the master's family sleeps safely in their comfortable beds, something remarkable happens. Despite everything the system does to prevent it, slaves find ways to be human together. These moments of connection, brief and carefully hidden, represent the most powerful form of resistance against a system designed to isolate and dehumanize. Stories become the lifeline that connects slaves to their humanity and to each other. In whispered conversations after dark, older slaves pass down memories of freedom, tales of ancestors who lived as people rather than property, myths that preserve cultural identity that slavery tries to erase. These stories serve multiple purposes. They maintain connection to a world beyond slavery. They provide hope that different ways of life are possible, and they create bonds between people who share the experience of systematic oppression. The stories aren't always about the past. Sometimes they're about the future, imagined worlds where children grow up free, where families stay together, where work serves the worker rather than an owner. These future-focused tales serve as mental rehearsals for freedom, keeping alive the cognitive and emotional skills that free life would require. They're acts of imagination that slavery tries to make impossible. Songs develop their own secret meanings in slave communities. Melodies that sound innocent to overseers carry messages about escape routes, warnings about dangerous situations, or simply expressions of shared suffering and mutual support. The communal act of singing creates bonds that transcend individual isolation and maintains cultural practices that slavery attempts to destroy. Religious practices, adapted and hidden from master oversight, provide frameworks for understanding suffering and maintaining hope. These might be traditional beliefs from slaves' original cultures, reinterpretations of imposed Greek religion that emphasize justice and liberation, or entirely new spiritual systems developed in response to the unique horrors of slavery. Faith becomes a form of resistance when it insists on human dignity in circumstances designed to deny it. Healing knowledge passes between slaves in networks that operate outside official medical systems. Women share information about herbs that ease pain, prevent pregnancy, or induce miscarriage when bringing children into slavery seems too cruel. Traditional healing practices from various cultures blend into new systems of care that emphasize mutual aid and community support over individual treatment. Food sharing, when possible, creates moments of abundance and generosity in a world of artificial scarcity. Slaves who manage to acquire extra food share it with others, creating networks of reciprocal support that help everyone survive. These acts of generosity are dangerous because they could be interpreted as theft or conspiracy, but they maintain the human capacity for altruism in circumstances designed to make everyone selfish. Childcare becomes a communal responsibility among slaves when official family structures are disrupted by sale and separation. Children who lose parents are informally adopted by other slaves. Knowledge and skills are taught collectively rather than individually. The entire slave community takes responsibility for protecting and nurturing the next generation, maintaining family bonds that transcend blood relationships. Teaching and learning continue in hidden ways despite efforts to limit slave education. Literate slaves teach others to read and write in secret. Skilled craftsmen pass on their knowledge to younger slaves. Cultural traditions are transmitted through demonstration and practice rather than formal instruction. These educational activities maintain intellectual development and preserve knowledge that slavery tries to eliminate. Games and entertainment provide brief respites from the constant stress and surveillance of slave life. Simple competitions, storytelling contests, music and dance when it's safe to make noise. All these activities help maintain joy and playfulness despite overwhelming oppression. The fact that slaves can still laugh, still play, still find moments of happiness becomes a form of victory over systems designed to eliminate all pleasure from their lives. Romantic relationships, when they can develop, provide emotional support and human connection that help slaves maintain their capacity for love and intimacy. These relationships are constantly threatened by the possibility of separation through sale, but their very existence proves that slavery cannot completely destroy the human need for emotional and physical connection. Love becomes an act of resistance when it asserts the value of human bonds over property rights. Artistic expression finds ways to emerge even under the most restrictive circumstances. Slaves create visual art from whatever materials are available, compose poems and songs that capture their experiences, tell stories that preserve their creativity and cultural identity. Art becomes a way of processing trauma, maintaining cultural connections, and asserting the human capacity for beauty, even in ugly circumstances. Mutual protection networks develop among slaves to help each other avoid punishment, escape detection when breaking rules, and share information about dangerous situations. These networks require enormous trust and sophisticated communication systems that operate invisibly to masters and overseers. They prove that slaves can organize effectively and maintain loyalty to each other despite pressures to compete and betray. Mentoring relationships between experienced and new slaves help recent arrivals learn survival skills while maintaining some connection to the outside world. Older slaves teach newcomers how to read their master's moods, how to avoid punishment, how to preserve some sense of self, despite systematic dehumanization. These teaching relationships maintain both practical knowledge and emotional support across generations of enslaved people. Memory preservation becomes a collective responsibility when individual slaves lose pieces of their personal histories to trauma and time. Other slaves help maintain memories of families, origins, and experiences that might otherwise be forgotten. This communal memory keeps personal histories alive and maintains connections to identities that slavery tries to erase. Language preservation occurs when slaves from similar cultural backgrounds maintain their original languages in hidden conversations. These linguistic connections preserve cultural identity and provide communication methods that masters can't understand or control. Speaking your own language becomes an act of resistance against the forced adoption of your oppressor's tongue. Skill sharing helps slaves develop capabilities that might be useful for survival, resistance, or eventual escape. Knowledge about navigation, local geography, sympathetic free people, or useful trades passes between slaves through informal networks. These educational activities maintain hope and practical preparation for the possibility of freedom. Death rituals, adapted to slavery's constraints, help maintain dignity and cultural identity even in death. Slaves find ways to honor deceased community members despite restrictions on funeral practices. These rituals maintain connections between the living and dead and preserve cultural practices that assert the spiritual value of enslaved people's lives. Conflict resolution within slave communities becomes crucial when disputes could attract unwanted attention from masters. Slaves develop their own justice systems and mediation practices that resolve problems while maintaining community unity. These systems preserve social skills and moral values that slavery tries to destroy while keeping internal conflicts from becoming opportunities for master intervention. The most remarkable aspect of these hidden communities is how they maintain human values that the larger society claims to support but systematically violates. Slaves practice justice, mercy, loyalty, and mutual aid more consistently than the free citizens who own them. They create democratic decision-making processes while living under absolute tyranny. They maintain educational and cultural institutions while being denied access to official learning. These underground communities prove that humanity is remarkably resilient, and that systems designed to destroy human dignity can never be completely successful. Even under the worst possible circumstances, people find ways to care for each other, to maintain hope, to preserve culture, and to resist oppression through the simple act of remaining human. But the existence of these communities also highlights the enormous waste and tragedy of slavery. The creativity, intelligence, compassion, and organizational ability that slaves demonstrate in creating these hidden societies represents human potential that slavery systematically suppresses and destroys. Every moment spent in maintaining humanity against systematic dehumanization is a moment that could have been spent in free pursuit of human flourishing. The temporary and fragile nature of these communities also reminds us that individual moments of humanity can't compensate for systematic oppression. A shared song can't heal the trauma of rape. A communal meal can't replace adequate nutrition. A storytelling session can't substitute for education and personal development. These moments of resistance and connection are precious and important, but they're also desperately inadequate responses to the overwhelming brutality of slavery. Still, the fact that such communities exist at all, under such impossible circumstances, provides perhaps the strongest argument against slavery's fundamental premise. If people who are supposedly naturally suited for bondage can create sophisticated social systems, preserve complex cultural knowledge, and maintain moral values under extreme oppression, then, clearly, the justifications for slavery are lies designed to serve the interests of those who benefit from human exploitation. But even as we celebrate the resilience and creativity of enslaved communities, we must remember that these achievements come at enormous cost. The energy and resources devoted to basic psychological and physical survival under slavery represent human potential that could have been directed toward art, science, philosophy, and all the other pursuits that make life meaningful. Slavery doesn't just exploit what slaves produce. It destroys what they could have produced if they had been free. And perhaps most tragically, the very success of enslaved communities in maintaining humanity often gets used as justification for slavery itself. Masters point to slaves' ability to survive, and occasionally thrive as evidence that slavery isn't really so bad, that enslaved people are actually better off than they would be if free. The resilience that allows people to survive systematic oppression becomes twisted into an argument for continuing that oppression. This is the final cruelty of slavery. It not only destroys human potential, but uses the evidence of human strength in the face of that destruction as justification for continued destruction. The very qualities that make people admirable become arguments for their continued exploitation. Yet despite all these contradictions and tragedies, the hidden communities that slaves create remain powerful testimony to the indestructible nature of human dignity. No system of oppression, no matter how sophisticated or brutal, can completely eliminate the human capacity for connection, creativity, and resistance. And that may be the most important lesson from the entire horrific story of Greek slavery. The physical toll of slavery extends far beyond the immediate effects of hard labor and violent punishment. The human body, pushed beyond its limits day after day for years or decades, develops a catalogue of injuries and ailments that would break modern people within weeks. Your spine curves from constant bending over tools and crops. Your joints swell from repetitive motions and heavy lifting. Your hands become gnarled claws, permanently shaped by the tools you're forced to use. Malnutrition stunts growth in children and weakens adults until they become susceptible to diseases that well-fed people could easily fight off. The deliberate starvation diet that keeps slaves desperate and compliant also ensures that wounds heal poorly, bones break easily, and immune systems fail regularly. Your body becomes a battleground where inadequate nutrition fights against excessive demands for energy and strength. Respiratory problems develop from years of breathing stone dust in mines, chaff from grain processing, smoke from poorly ventilated cooking fires, and the general air pollution of cramped living quarters shared with too many people and animals. The constant cough that most slaves develop isn't just annoying, it's a symptom of progressive lung damage that will eventually kill you through suffocation or infection. Skin conditions become epidemic in slave populations due to poor hygiene, contaminated water, shared living spaces, and exposure to harsh chemicals and environmental conditions. Sores that won't heal, infections that spread from person to person, parasitic infestations that cause constant itching and pain. All these become normal parts of slave life. Your skin, the barrier between your body and the hostile world, becomes just another source of suffering. Dental problems develop early and worsen rapidly due to poor nutrition, lack of oral hygiene, and the gritty bread that wears teeth down like millstones. By your 20s, eating becomes painful. By your 30s, many teeth are broken or missing entirely. By your 40s, if you live that long, chewing solid food becomes nearly impossible. The simple act of eating becomes another daily torture. Eye problems result from poor lighting, flying debris from construction and agricultural work, smoke exposure, and general neglect of basic safety measures. Slaves who lose vision in one or both eyes become even more vulnerable to accidents and abuse. Partial blindness makes work more difficult while providing no reduction in work expectations or punishment for failure to meet quotas. Reproductive health suffers enormously under slavery, particularly for women who face constant threat of sexual violence, poor nutrition during pregnancy, and complete lack of prenatal or postnatal care. Miscarriages, stillbirths, and deaths in childbirth become tragically common. Children who survive birth often suffer from developmental problems caused by maternal malnutrition and stress. Sexually transmitted diseases spread rapidly through slave populations due to forced prostitution, rape by masters and overseers, and the general lack of any medical care for sexual health issues. These diseases cause pain, sterility, and death, while being completely preventable and treatable with proper medical attention that slaves never receive. Injuries from accidents and violence accumulate over time until even minor new trauma can cause disproportionate damage. A twisted ankle becomes a permanent limp when you're forced to keep working on it. A cut becomes a major infection when you can't keep it clean. A bruise becomes a blood clot when you can't rest and recover properly. Your body loses its ability to heal itself under the constant stress of slavery. Mental health deteriorates under the constant stress, trauma, and hopelessness of slavery. What we would now recognize as depression, anxiety, PTSD, and other psychological disorders become epidemic among enslaved populations. But there's no concept of mental health care, no recognition that psychological trauma requires treatment, no allowance for the fact that broken spirits need healing just as much as broken bones. Sleep deprivation becomes chronic when you're forced to work long hours, live in crowded and noisy conditions, and remain constantly vigilant against threats from masters, overseers, and fellow slaves driven to desperation. The cumulative effect of years without adequate rest weakens your immune system, impairs your judgment, and reduces your life expectancy significantly. Substance abuse sometimes develops among slaves who have access to alcohol or other drugs that provide temporary escape from their circumstances. But even this form of self-medication carries enormous risks because intoxicated slaves face severe punishment and because addiction makes an already desperate situation even worse. Premature aging affects all slaves as the combination of hard labor, poor nutrition, constant stress, and lack of medical care takes its toll. 20-year-old slaves look 40. 40-year-old slaves look 60. The few who survive to actual old age are barely recognizable as human beings. So thoroughly has slavery destroyed their bodies and minds. Self-harm sometimes becomes a coping mechanism for slaves who have no other way to deal with psychological trauma or to exert some small control over their circumstances. Cutting, burning, or other forms of self-injury provide temporary relief from emotional pain or serve as attempts to make oneself less attractive to masters seeking sexual pleasure. Suicide attempts increase among slave populations, particularly during times of extreme stress or when punishment becomes so severe that death seems preferable to continued suffering. But even suicide is difficult for slaves to accomplish because they're watched constantly and have little access to effective means of self-destruction. The medical care that slaves receive is designed to maintain their utility rather than their health or comfort. Broken bones are set quickly and carelessly to minimize time off work. Infections are treated with the cheapest possible remedies. Serious illnesses are often ignored until they threaten the slave's ability to work, by which time treatment is usually too late to be effective. Pregnancy and childbirth receive minimal medical attention because slave women are expected to work almost until delivery and return to work within days of giving birth. The high rates of maternal and infant mortality among slaves reflect not just poor nutrition and living conditions, but complete indifference to the health and welfare of enslaved families. Occupational injuries and diseases develop from specific types of work that slaves are forced to perform. Mine slaves develop lung diseases from stone dust. Agricultural slaves suffer from repetitive stress injuries and exposure to harsh weather. Household slaves develop back problems from constant bending and lifting. Each type of slavery brings its own catalogue of predictable health problems. Communicable diseases spread rapidly through slave populations due to overcrowded living conditions, poor sanitation, contaminated water supplies, and the general weakness that malnutrition and overwork create. Epidemics that might be minor inconveniences for well-fed free people become deadly plagues in slave quarters. The lack of preventive care means that minor health issues become major problems over time. A small cut becomes a serious infection. Poor posture becomes permanent spinal damage. Mild malnutrition becomes life-threatening weakness. Early intervention could prevent most of these problems, but such intervention is rarely provided for slaves. Dental care is virtually non-existent for slaves. leading to widespread tooth loss, gum disease, and oral infections that can spread to other parts of the body. The constant pain from dental problems makes eating difficult and sleeping nearly impossible, adding yet another layer of suffering to already difficult lives. The cumulative effect of all these health problems is that slaves age rapidly and die young, often from combinations of ailments that would be easily treatable in people who received adequate nutrition, rest, and medical care. The average life expectancy for slaves is significantly lower than for free people, and the quality of life during those shortened years is substantially worse. Perhaps most tragically, many of the health problems that slaves develop are entirely preventable and would not occur in people who received basic nutrition, adequate rest, safe working conditions, and routine medical care. The suffering is not an unfortunate side effect of slavery. It's a deliberate result of systems designed to extract maximum labor from human beings while investing minimum resources in their welfare. The masters justify this neglect by arguing that slaves are naturally suited to hard labor and primitive living conditions, that they don't experience pain the same way free people do, and that providing better healthcare would be wasted on people of inferior constitution. These beliefs allow masters to maintain their sense of moral superiority while systematically destroying the bodies and minds of the people they own. But the reality is that slaves suffer just as much as free people, probably more due to their inability to escape or seek help when pain becomes unbearable. Their capacity for physical and emotional suffering is fully human, and their need for medical care is just as legitimate as anyone else's. The difference is that they have no power to demand such care and no legal standing to complain when it's denied. The long-term effects of slavery on physical health extend beyond the enslaved individuals to their children and grandchildren. Malnutrition during pregnancy affects fetal development. Trauma during childbirth can cause lasting problems for both mothers and babies. The stress and poor health of enslaved parents affects their ability to care for their children, creating cycles of health problems that persist across generations. Even slaves who eventually gain freedom often find that the health damage caused by slavery is permanent and progressive. Former slaves frequently die young from conditions that developed during their enslavement, but continued to worsen even after gaining freedom. The physical cost of slavery extends far beyond the period of actual enslavement. The irony is that healthy, well-cared-for slaves would actually be more productive and valuable than sick, malnourished ones. But the short-term costs of providing adequate care seem excessive to masters who can always purchase replacement slaves when their current ones wear out. The economic logic of slavery encourages treating human beings as disposable tools rather than valuable assets worth maintaining. This disposability is perhaps the most horrifying aspect of slavery's impact on physical health. When human beings are cheap enough to replace, there's no economic incentive to preserve their health or extend their lives. The suffering and early death of slaves become acceptable business expenses in a system that measures human worth only in terms of immediate productive capacity. And yet, even under these impossible conditions, the human body's capacity for endurance and adaptation sometimes produces remarkable examples of survival and resilience. Some slaves live longer than might be expected, maintain their health better than their circumstances would suggest, and even find ways to care for themselves and others despite systematic neglect. These exceptional cases don't justify slavery, but they do testify to the incredible strength of the human spirit and the remarkable resilience of the human body when fighting for survival. The comparison with other ancient slavery systems reveals that Greek slavery was particularly sophisticated in its psychological control, while being typically brutal in its physical demands. Unlike some systems that relied primarily on physical coercion, Greek masters developed elaborate ideological justifications for slavery that made resistance more difficult and compliance more complete. Roman slavery, for example, was often more explicitly violent, but also provided clearer paths to freedom through manumission. Egyptian slavery was more closely tied to specific labor projects and seasonal work patterns. Mesopotamian slavery was more integrated into existing social hierarchies and family structures. But Greek slavery was distinctive in its combination of economic integration, philosophical justification, and systematic psychological control. The Greek innovation was making slavery seem natural and beneficial rather than simply necessary or profitable. By developing intellectual frameworks that presented slavery as part of the cosmic order, Greek masters created a system that was self-reinforcing and resistant to moral criticism. Slaves were taught to see their enslavement as evidence of their natural inferiority rather than as an injustice inflicted upon them. This psychological sophistication made Greek slavery particularly difficult to resist or escape, both physically and mentally. The elaborate surveillance systems, the networks of informants, the careful management of slave populations to prevent organization and solidarity, all these techniques made Greek slavery a model that later slave societies would study and imitate. The geographic scale of Greek slavery was also remarkable. While other ancient societies might enslave neighboring peoples or prisoners of war, the Greeks developed a truly international slave trade that brought people from across the known world. The diversity of enslaved populations made unity more difficult while providing masters with slaves who had specialized skills from many different cultures. The economic integration of slavery into Greek society was more complete than in many other systems. While some societies used slavery as a supplement to free labor, the Greeks made slavery essential to virtually every aspect of their economy. This made abolition not just morally difficult, but economically unimaginable for most free Greeks. The intellectual achievements of Greek civilization, built on slavery, provided justifications and rationalizations that influenced slavery systems throughout history. The philosophical arguments developed by Aristotle and others to justify slavery would be recycled and adapted by later slave societies, including the American South, to defend their own systems of human exploitation. The gender dynamics of Greek slavery were particularly complex, with different expectations and opportunities for male and female slaves. While all slaves faced exploitation, female slaves faced additional layers of sexual violence and reproductive control that made their experiences distinctively horrific. The normalization of sexual slavery in Greek society provided models for the sexual exploitation of enslaved women in many later societies. The religious integration of slavery into Greek society was also noteworthy. Unlike some societies where slavery was seen as a necessary evil or a temporary condition, the Greeks developed religious justifications that made slavery seem like a permanent and divinely ordained aspect of cosmic order. This made resistance not just politically dangerous, but spiritually problematic for people who had internalized Greek religious beliefs. The urban nature of much Greek slavery was distinctive compared to other ancient systems that were primarily agricultural. The concentration of slaves in cities created different dynamics of control and resistance than existed in rural plantation systems. Urban slaves had more opportunities for communication and organization, but also faced more intensive surveillance and punishment. The educational aspects of Greek slavery were both more extensive and more limiting than in many other systems. While some slaves received substantial education that made them valuable for complex tasks, this education was always designed to serve masters' interests rather than slaves' development. The literate slave was still a slave, and education could never become a path to freedom or self-determination. The family structures under Greek slavery were particularly vulnerable to disruption through sale and inheritance. Unlike some societies where slave families had some protection or recognition, Greek law treated slave families as purely economic arrangements that could be dissolved at any time for any reason. This created additional psychological trauma and made long-term family planning impossible for enslaved people. The legal status of slaves in Greek society was more thoroughly developed than in many other ancient systems, but this legal clarity often worked against slaves rather than for them. The precise definition of slaves as property, rather than people with limited rights, meant that there were fewer ambiguities that clever slaves might exploit to improve their conditions. The manumission process in Greek society was more restrictive than in some other systems, requiring not just master consent, but often community approval and significant financial payments. This made freedom more difficult to achieve and more precarious when obtained. Former slaves remained vulnerable to re-enslavement and faced significant social and economic disadvantages even after gaining legal freedom. The cultural impact of Greek slavery extended far beyond the immediate victims to influence art, literature, philosophy, and political thought throughout the ancient world and beyond. The normalization of slavery in Greek culture provided intellectual frameworks that supported slavery in many subsequent societies, and made abolition more difficult when it was finally attempted. But perhaps the most significant comparison is with the ideals that Greek society claimed to represent. While other ancient societies often practiced slavery without claiming to champion human dignity and freedom, the Greeks developed elaborate ideologies of liberty and democracy, while simultaneously enslaving millions of people. This contradiction between ideals and practice made Greek slavery particularly hypocritical and psychologically damaging for both slaves and masters. The legacy of Greek slavery includes not just the immediate suffering it caused, but the intellectual and cultural frameworks it created that supported human exploitation for centuries afterward. The philosophical justifications, the economic systems, the legal structures, and the psychological techniques developed by Greek slave societies provided blueprints for oppression that influenced human history long after the original Greek city-states had disappeared. Yet the resistance and resilience shown by Greek slaves also provided models for later resistance movements and contributed to the eventual development of human rights concepts that would ultimately condemn slavery itself. The very contradictions in Greek society that made slavery so hypocritical also created intellectual tools that would eventually be used to argue against human bondage. The questions raised by Greek slavery about human nature, social organization, economic systems, and moral responsibility remain relevant today as we grapple with other forms of systematic oppression and exploitation. The lessons learned from studying Greek slavery can inform our understanding of how human societies create and maintain systems of inequality and how those systems can be challenged and changed. But perhaps the most important lesson from Greek slavery is the simplest one: that human beings have an inherent dignity and worth that cannot be legitimately subordinated to economic interests, social convenience, or ideological justification. The suffering of Greek slaves was not necessary for civilization to advance. It was a choice made by people who prioritized their own comfort and power over the basic humanity of others. As we've journeyed through the horrific reality of slavery in ancient Greece, one truth emerges with devastating clarity. You wouldn't have lasted a day. Not because you're weak or unprepared, but because the system was designed to break human beings in ways that modern people can barely comprehend. The casual brutality, the systematic dehumanization, the complete absence of hope or dignity, all of this was considered normal, natural, and necessary by people who saw themselves as the pinnacle of human civilization. Every marble statue we admire, every philosophical text we study, every democratic ideal we celebrate, all of it was built on a foundation of human suffering so vast and systematic that it staggers the imagination. The glory of Greece was purchased with the blood, sweat, and tears of millions of people whose names we'll never know, whose stories were never recorded, whose humanity was denied so completely that they barely exist in the historical record, except as property inventories and economic statistics. The slaves who died in the silver mines of Laurium financed the golden age of Athens. The women who were raped in household bedrooms enabled the leisure time that produced great art and literature. The children raised from birth as property grew up to serve the families that produced great philosophers and politicians. The men who broke their backs in olive groves and grain fields fed the citizens who debated the nature of justice and virtue. This isn't ancient history. This is a mirror held up to every society that claims moral superiority while systematically exploiting vulnerable populations. The same psychological mechanisms that allowed Greeks to maintain their sense of righteousness while owning human beings are still operating today. The same economic logic that made slavery profitable then makes exploitation profitable now. The same ideological frameworks that justified bondage then continue to justify inequality now. The slaves of ancient Greece teach us something crucial about human nature: that people can endure almost anything if they must, that dignity and love can survive under even the most dehumanizing conditions, and that resistance is possible even when it seems utterly hopeless. But they also teach us that such endurance comes at enormous cost, that survival often requires psychological adaptations that damage people for generations, and that resistance is usually crushed by overwhelming force. Perhaps most importantly, they teach us that slavery was not an inevitable stage in human development or a necessary foundation for civilization. It was a choice a choice made by people who decided that their comfort and prosperity mattered more than other people's freedom and dignity. And it could have been different. The technological knowledge, the agricultural techniques, the artistic skills, the intellectual achievements, all of this could have been accomplished by free people working for their own benefit, rather than enslaved people working for others' profit. The Greeks convinced themselves that slavery was natural, beneficial, and divinely ordained. They developed elaborate philosophical justifications for treating human beings as property. They created legal systems that defined people as things. They built economic structures that depended on unpaid labor. They constructed social hierarchies that placed human worth on a sliding scale based on legal status rather than inherent dignity. But underneath all these justifications and systems was a simple truth. They enslaved people because they could, because it benefited them, and because they didn't care about the suffering it caused. All the philosophy and law and social theory was just elaborate rationalization for doing what they wanted to do anyway. The intellectual sophistication of Greek culture didn't make them more moral. It made them more effective at justifying their immorality. The lesson for us is clear. Intelligence, education, cultural achievement, and technological advancement don't automatically produce moral progress. Some of history's most horrific systems of oppression have been created by highly educated, culturally sophisticated societies that saw themselves as the height of human development. Moral progress requires conscious choice, not just intellectual development. The slaves of ancient Greece were not different from us. They had the same capacity for love, hope, creativity, and dignity that we have. They suffered the same when beaten, grieved the same when separated from loved ones, and yearned for freedom the same as any human being. The only difference was that they were born into a world that refused to recognize their humanity. Their suffering was not meaningful. It didn't serve a greater purpose. It didn't contribute to human progress. It was simply waste, the destruction of human potential on an enormous scale for the benefit of a small minority who had the power to exploit them. Every day of their enslavement was a day of human possibility lost forever. And yet their resistance, their resilience, their refusal to be completely broken represents something powerful and inspiring. In the darkest moments of human history, when systems of oppression seem overwhelming and permanent, people still find ways to maintain their humanity and help each other survive. Love persists. Hope survives. Dignity endures. These qualities don't make oppression acceptable, but they do make human beings remarkable. The story of Greek slavery is ultimately a story about choices. The choices that created the system, the choices that maintained it, the choices that eventually ended it, and the choices we make today about how to respond to the legacy of that suffering. We can choose to learn from it or ignore it. We can choose to recognize the humanity of all people or continue to create hierarchies that deny dignity to some. We can choose to build societies on justice and equality or continue to prioritize the comfort of the powerful over the rights of the vulnerable. The slaves of ancient Greece can't tell us their stories directly. Their voices were silenced, their experiences erased, their humanity denied. But in the archaeological evidence, in the legal documents, in the casual references by their masters, we can piece together something of what they endured. And in that piecing together, we honor their memory and acknowledge the debt that civilization owes to people who were forced to build it without being allowed to enjoy it. You wouldn't have lasted a day as a slave in ancient Greece. None of us would have. But millions of people did last. Not just days, but years, and decades, and entire lifetimes. They endured because they had no choice. They suffered because others chose to make them suffer. They died because their lives were considered less important than other people's profits. Their suffering was not noble. Their endurance was not inspiring. Their deaths were not meaningful. They were simply human beings who deserved better than they got. And the fact that they didn't get what they deserved is an indictment not of them, but of the society that enslaved them and the ideology that justified their enslavement. But their humanity, preserved against all odds under the most dehumanizing conditions imaginable, remains as a testament to something indestructible in the human spirit. They couldn't be completely broken. They couldn't be entirely silenced. They couldn't be totally erased. And in their survival, in their resistance, in their stubborn refusal to accept that they deserved their fate, they left us a legacy more valuable than any philosophical treatise or architectural marvel. They left us the knowledge that people are stronger than the systems that oppress them, that love is more powerful than hate, that hope can survive even in hopeless circumstances, and that the moral arc of the universe, however slowly, bends toward justice. Not because justice is inevitable, but because people like them refuse to stop fighting for it, even when they have every reason to give up. The slaves of ancient Greece are gone, their suffering is over, but their lesson remains, that human dignity cannot be destroyed, only denied, and that every denial of that dignity is a choice that could have been made differently. In remembering them, we honor not just their memory, but our own obligation to ensure that such choices are never made again. The glory of Greece was built on their bones. The beauty of its art was paid for with their blood. The wisdom of its philosophy was purchased with their tears. But the greatest truth they left us is this: no achievement, however magnificent, justifies the destruction of human dignity. No civilization, however glorious, is worth building on a foundation of human suffering. And no ideology, however sophisticated, can legitimize treating people as property. This is what it meant to be a slave in ancient Greece. This is why you wouldn't have lasted a day. And this is why we must never forget that the true measure of a civilization is not what it builds for the powerful, but how it treats the powerless. In that measure, ancient Greece, for all its achievements, failed utterly. And the slaves who paid the price for that failure deserve to be remembered not as footnotes to someone else's glory, but as human beings whose lives mattered, whose suffering was real, and whose humanity was never diminished by the people who refused to see it. Their story is not ancient history. It's a warning about what happens when societies choose power over justice, profit over people, and comfort over conscience. And it's a reminder that the price of such choices is always paid by those who have no choice at all.